Okay, so I appreciate everybody on their patience, and what we're going to do this evening is we're going to, you might have to reboot me here. I'm not forwarding. There we go. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about different aspects of cognition. And when we look at consciousness, over the years, there's been a lot of questions about what is consciousness, how does it function, what are the networks of consciousness, and quite frankly, we actually still don't really know exactly where consciousness is housed or how it functions. So in the world of science, we're still working on this, but we've progressed a lot and we understand it better. So as we went along through the world, we said, okay, well, you have these 5 senses, and everybody would learn the 5 senses, like sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch. And they go, here's your 5 senses. But there's actually, we've learned more than 5 senses. So as we're going along, we're building better and better understandings of how things work. So you have sight, smell, touch, taste, but then there's proprioception. And proprioception's like information from your joints in your body. Then there's vestibular input. So you have vestibular input about where your head is in space. And then you have interoception. And interoception is information that comes from your organs and comes from your viscera and comes from your blood vessels. And what we're going to do, because we're going to be looking at stress and anxiety, we're going to look a little bit into interoception as well. So these different aspects of our body are all working together to help us to form a perception of ourselves. And it's really kind of interesting because this gentleman, his name was Charles Sherrington, and in 1906 he got a Nobel Prize simply for saying that there's a reflex. And they go, there's a reflex. And the point here is really to say where we're moving toward in the conversation is we're saying, what happens for people when they get injuries? What happens for people when they get concussions? What happens for people when they get vestibular problems? What happens for people when they get POTS, which is called postural orthostatic tachycardic syndrome? And what we for sure understand is that a lot of people get anxiety when they're not well. And anxiety is related to not feeling well. And as they go through a process to try to understand what's happening, and hey, good evening, glad you made it. And so they're trying to understand what's happening and what do I do, and they're seeing different medical providers. And as the medical providers are working to understand things, we still have gaps. So there's a big question of why. And a large part of it is the evolution of knowledge and understanding. And this was a huge step in the knowledge and understanding of neuroscience, because this gentleman, Charles Sherrington, gets a Nobel Prize in the early 1900s because he said there's a reflex. So, you know, the thing that we do all the time where you see it on television and you hit the knee and the guy kicks and, you know, it's over-exaggerated and it's funny. Well, that was worthy of a Nobel Prize, to say that sensory information goes in and that sensory information has a motor response and it comes back out. But that wasn't that long ago, actually. And so what ends up happening is they start to build theories about how things work. And there's a hierarchical theory. And a hierarchical theory says that you're really just a composite of reflexes. So I shine a light in your eye and the pupil constricts or moves, or I hit your knee and that creates a certain type of a movement, or I scrape your foot and that creates a certain type of movement. And when you add up all of these reflexes, some of them are more at a spinal cord level, some of them are more at a brainstem level, like breathing, digestion, things like that are more at brainstem levels. Some of them are at higher brainstem levels, processing lights and sounds and things. And then some of them eventually add up to help you gain consciousness and cognition. And there are actually people, they say, oh, you're just thinking meat. And they say all you are is a conglomeration of reflexes. And you actually are just reflexively creating your reality. And there's some interesting things to it, because they look at patterns of decision making, and people actually, parts of their brain will actually activate to, say, move their arm to reach out and grab something a couple milliseconds before they consciously make that decision. So they go, you see, it's just a reflex. That's all it is. And it's a very materialistic perspective of the world, but it is a perspective that some people have. Well, as they evolved and went on, they said, well, wait a minute, what we've noticed is that your higher brain actually can send messages back down. And I put this arrow here, which you may be able to see on the screen. So I put that black arrow down there, and it says, newer hierarchical theories take in a top-down and a bottom-up approach. So it's like considered really advanced. So some people would say, oh, all these reflexes build up to help you have consciousness. And then some people say, but your mind can come back down and actually control these reflexes. And so they say your brain is actually controlling information as it comes in. And that led to a new level of trying to understand reality. And they said, well, I guess that information's coming up from down below into higher processing centers, but actually higher processing centers are coming down and controlling the information below. And there's a bottom-up argument and there's a top-down argument about how things work or perceptions. And then there's an idea that both of those are happening at once, and it's considered a pretty amazing idea. Beep, beep. I don't know what happened. You just want to go to the next? It just... Oh. There we go. And so I think what ends up happening is now there's this concept, as we're moving from just a fully materialistic perspective of the world, and we're starting to understand a little bit more about frequencies and how different frequencies can affect you emotionally, how different colors can affect you emotionally, and how different sounds can affect you emotionally, that we understand that there's this resonance, and different parts of your brain have different resonant frequencies. So like patients with Parkinson's have certain tremor rates because those cells actually have this tremor rate. Or if someone has a tremor that's bigger, that's more of a cerebellar tremor because that's the frequency of the cerebellum. But if everything's good, you don't have the tremors because all the frequencies are designed to work together in harmony to create health and wellness and well-being. So what we're understanding is that it's not even just top-down, bottom-up, it's a full resonance of your system. How's your blood sugar affect your health? How does your exercise levels affect your health? How does your nutrition affect your health? And each one of those has an impact on your emotions. And then how does your emotional levels affect each one of those? Because you can alter your emotional state and it can alter your stomach acid. Or you can alter your emotional state and it can alter your digestive system. So when we're looking at it, you can't just say, oh, you know, you don't have a brain tumor and you don't have nystagmus, you say you have vertigo, do you have anxiety? And I think if we go out in the world and we ask people, how many people have anxiety who also have vertigo? Of course you do, because vertigo gives people anxiety. Or if you have a concussion and you can't think, it gives people anxiety. So when we're looking at this anxiety problem, something's off in the body. And when something's off in the body, you're supposed to have responses to it so that you can make decisions to change your life. And those responses might be associated with displeasure. Some people say that we either move toward love or away from pain. And those are our big motivators. Are we going to go toward love or away from pain? Well, both are healthy for you. So you might need a little bit of pain to move you into a healthy position. And that can be these things. Well, now a paper came out recently. It's called the Somato-cognitive Action Network, which is really exciting for body workers. Like you're a massage therapist and you're looking at this, and you've known this. I mean, you've been a massage therapist for a couple of years, right? And the thing is that in say body work, we always know that what we do affects people emotionally, but then it gets a little kind of odd, you know, like, well, you're doing emotional work or something, or you're going to change someone's emotionality, and you know, how would that work and why would you be doing it? Well, the thing is that we know when you exercise you feel better. Well, what is that? That's movement. You know, we know that when you get a massage you feel better. We know that when you get an adjustment you feel better. We know that when you lift weights you feel better. Why? Because one of the theories is that there's this somato-cognitive action network. So you have somato means body, and cognitive means cognition, and then action network. And when they look at it, they've actually done studies, and they've found that this body cognition center is interrelated, and it goes to different areas, and it's pretty exciting. Some of those areas are in your cerebral cortex, so they're firing into the higher areas of your brain. Some of them are over here into an area called your basal ganglion. Now, the basal ganglion is a pretty intense area to have problems with because the basal ganglion is down inside of your brain. Basal means lower, and then ganglion means cells. Well, what does it do? It's like the brakes. It puts the brakes onto the system and helps you control it. So people who have fear associated with OCD and things like that, the basal ganglion's not working so well. So all of a sudden, they don't realize it, but they get a little bit worried, like, I don't want to lock my kids in the car. And they start to get a little wound up with that, and they start to think about it too much. They have to be able to control that idea and just not be too concerned about it. Or they might be worried about, did I leave the fire on in the house? Well, you got to go in there and you got to look at how that's going, and you have to be able to leave the house and not worry too much about it. Happens a lot for people after head injuries, and this will get wound up. Well, it also filters movements. So all of a sudden people will get tight, like their neck will get tight and it'll get really stiff. And then they think, well, I'm just stressed out, so my neck gets tight. But actually, it can be the basal ganglion. And when that starts to happen, it changes their cognition. It changes the way they think. So like the brakes to their neck aren't working really well, but also the brakes to their emotionality and their decision making might not be working really well. So they start to think about things too much and concentrate on them too much. And then they think, well, I'm just stressing out, so my neck gets tight. But actually, those two things are related. And what's happening there is that their basal ganglion starts to fire incorrectly. So it doesn't control itself correctly. Then you'll have another area like your thalamus. So the thalamus, they talk about, it filters all your sensory input except smell, but now as we're learning more, we know smell still goes through it a little bit, and the thalamus is filtering everything, and interestingly enough, it's also being controlled by the basal ganglion and by the frontal lobe, and we start to see that every area becomes more and more interconnected. And then you have the cerebellum. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later when we talk about the article for the NeuroEmotional Technique, because the researchers there were really surprised that the cerebellum was involved with cognition, because historically the cerebellum is considered only to control motor. But I think it's actually been a long time now. There's a book, The Cerebellum and Cognition, and it's a great book. And what they found is the cerebellum, which used to be thought to only deal with controlling movement, is also associated with cognition. So the one part of it in the midline, they call it the limbic cerebellum. So limbic is like emotional. And they talk about a cat when it goes up on the end and its hairs stand up on end and it's under stress responses and it goes into flexion. So you end up in flexion with this posturing, and you tend to go into these different stress responses. Next week, Dr. Bauth's going to talk a little bit about stress, and one of the things that he does really awesome work with is he changes people's postural responses. And the way his technique goes is when he changes their postural responses, they have these really significant changes in how they feel day to day. And then when they start to feel better, they start to make better decisions. And as they make better decisions, then they start to feel better. And so it's this really awesome loop of working to change these midline cerebellum activities, and then they have a chain of effect through the rest of the somato-cognitive action network. Well, I really like this. If you look up in the top left, you see this person's model, and they called this the dynamic self model. So they're looking at it and they're going, well, how do you form who you are? So when you look around the model, you'll see the different sensory systems. So like smell, taste, vestibular, interoception, proprioception, vision, hearing. Each one of those, the way that it looks is the arrows are going in, and as they go in, they get to the blue circle on the outside, and that's unisensory. So that's what we started to learn, like sounds a little bit more in your temporal lobe, vision's a little bit more in your occipital lobe, taste goes into a certain area, and then proprioception and movement goes up into some areas in your parietal lobe, and it's segmentalized. It's this 1800s, 1900s conceptualization of the world, and as we were learning, we had to segmentalize things. We have a specialist in the heart, and we have a specialist in the liver, and we have a specialist in the spine, but eventually everyone's realizing that your liver affects your heart and your heart affects your spine, and they're all interconnected. And so now we have more holistic medicine of understanding the connection. Well, part of that's the evolution of thought. So you have the unisensory, then you go in and you have multisensory, so that like you hear something and you smell something and you say, oh, I did leave the burner on, right? And so then you want to react to it. Whereas if you only heard something, you might not know what it was. You might hear shh. You might think somebody's crinkling paper. You might not think of it as some water's boiling or something. So you have to be able to take your different sensory modalities and put them together. And unfortunately, for a lot of people who have concussions or vertigo or the things that we see all the time, they can't quite put the multiple sensory information together in this level, the multisensory level. Now just imagine if you have a hard time, you don't even actually notice it. So you have vertigo and you feel like your world's spinning, but what you don't realize is that as you feel like your world's spinning, you're feeling something different from your shoulder than maybe what you're seeing in your world. And it gives you a sensory mismatch. Well, sensory mismatches are really unpleasant, but nobody's going to go to the doctor and say, my multisensory integration systems aren't doing very good. And I have a sensory mismatch because I think I see my world over here, but I feel my body over there. And because I have a sensory mismatch, I have anxiety. And what I really need, doctor, is for you to fix my multisensory integrative system so that I just don't have anxiety anymore. And the classic sensory mismatch to me is you're at the traffic light and a car pulls up and you think you rolled backward and you slam your brakes on. And so when you saw the car go forward, your brain just perceived you went backward, and you literally feel that happen. And so that is an issue with multisensory information, because you should have felt that you didn't go backward. So what you should have seen is the car go forward, you should have felt your body being in place, and you should have said the car went forward. But instead, you get this feeling of going backward, and to me, it's always a little bit stressful. I never expect it, right? So that's a multisensory system. And then ultimately, it goes into the self model. And the self model is saying, well, what's your body doing? Proprioception, interoception. But then what's your world doing? That's exteroception. And how is it doing? And how do you relate to your world? And when you have sensory mismatches with that, then you end up getting anxiety. But unfortunately, if you have anxiety from the top-down perspective, you may actually not trust what you're feeling. So here's the thing. If your anxiety gets to a certain state, maybe you get a head injury and your frontal lobe's hurt and it's not processing information really good through your temporal lobe, and you get anxiety, you might not trust what you're feeling. So now your body's trying to tell you, no, it really is spinning. It's happening. But you're saying, no, it's not, and you don't trust your intuition, you don't trust your gut feeling, you don't trust the decision that you want to make about your future, and you begin to lose trust for your own processing because the anxiety drove a sensory mismatch, or because the sensory mismatch drove the anxiety. And people get in these situations where they become a little paralyzed. It's paralyzed will. In NeuroEmotional Technique, one of the concepts that they invite people to consider is paralyzed will. And an idea is it your paralyzed will or someone else's paralyzed will? And you have to be able to be congruent with if you have a paralyzed will or maybe someone else has a paralyzed will, and you have to be able to see that. Like if you have a partner and they have a paralyzed will and they can't go forward and their anxiety is going up, how do you support that person? How do you recognize it? And NeuroEmotional Technique has some really wonderful ways to help people change their cognitive system so that they can interact with their world, whether that be their world of what they have to do or if the world of people, and how do I interact with people better. It's pretty awesome. So this is this dynamic self model related to how everything integrates and works together and functions. So one of the things that we're getting better at, and man, we got to get a lot better at it, is this idea of interoception. So this doctor, Sarah Garfinkel, has some of the better information on it. And interoception is this idea of how are you feeling your organs? How are you feeling your blood vessels? It's so amazing to me. We've started to look and we've learned that the blood flowing through your kidneys actually helps you to know if you're upright or not. The way that the blood moves through your arms helps you to understand what's happening in your world, but the way that the blood is not just pumping in and out of your heart, but the way that the blood's moving through your organs is related to this interoception, or how are the organs actually physically moving. And those messages go up into your vagus nerve. So a lot of people are reading the polyvagal theory, and the polyvagal theory is this idea about how the vagus nerve is connected to emotionality, and then how emotionality are changing the motor part of the vagus nerve. And so they're looking at now how the motor part of this vagus nerve, which controls your organs, it makes stomach acid, it does a whole bunch of things, is related to the sensory part, and then how emotions connect to them. So they have a couple of concepts that they've worked to look at. So one is interoceptive accuracy. So that's number one on the chart up there, interoceptive accuracy. And so it's hang on, I should switch those. I think it's better. Let's go to number two, interoceptive sensibility, which is this. If we ask you some questions, how do you answer it? It's really about, do you think you have a good sense of your own organ systems? So do you think you can feel your heartbeat? Like, how good are you at that? Okay? How good are you at monitoring your breathing? Like, do you feel like you really feel your lungs well? Do you feel your organs moving well, right? Remember, pancreatic cancer is, unfortunately, not many people survive that cancer. But part of the reason is it doesn't get diagnosed early enough because the pain sensors in the pancreas are not that sensitive. So not many people, like how many of you can say, I know what my stomach feels like? No? Look, you should come eat at my family's house. Because if you don't eat at least like 4.5 pounds of my great-grandmother's pasta, then, you know, she doesn't like it. She's like, you have to eat. Why you no eat? You need to eat. So you keep eating and eating and eating, and then it hurts. You feel your stomach. It's very heavy. You know, you get a good sensation of it, okay? Otherwise, you offend her, you know? And she was born in the 1800s, so she's not like, I'm having a multi-sensory problem here. You know, she just wants you to eat, and she feeds you, and then asks you why you're fat. It was amazing, actually. It was pretty incredible. So why you no eat? I lost weight. They were terrified. They were really, is something wrong with you? You don't feel good? So, but most people would know what that's like. So they could say, oh, I feel my stomach. I could perceive that. Or you could feel like maybe you eat something poisonous. You're used to feeling maybe like your intestines or something like that. But the pancreas, people don't usually feel. So they don't notice it until the cancer gets really bad and it starts to hurt real bad. And then they have a connection to their pancreas and they can perceive what it's doing or how it's moving. They go to the doctor and they find out. So there's these questions on interoceptive sensibility. How do you think you feel your organs? Some people think they feel them perfect. Well, here's the thing. Then there's a question for interoceptive accuracy. So what you can do is you can see if you're actually right. Now some of that takes, because they do this in a lab, she has a PhD, you can see all the cool machines she has behind her, and they have different ways to check it. But one really easy way is you ask the person if they think they're accurate to their heart rate, then you can just take their pulse here, and now while the person's taking my pulse, so let's say there's a person here and they were taking my pulse, I'm okay, thanks, and they're taking my pulse, I just make the sound. I go dun, 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 and I see if I'm accurate to taking my pulse. So if I believe that I have an extremely high capacity to perceive my own interoception, but I in fact am not accurate, that's associated with higher degrees of anxiety. So if a person thinks that they feel their organ systems really well and accurately, but they don't, it's associated with a higher degree of anxiety. They looked at stockbrokers, and the stockbrokers who were picking the stocks more accurately had high interoceptive sensibility and high accuracies. So they could really feel the gut feeling. They could actually feel it. You can train this. You can learn to train to feel your breathing or to feel your heart rate and be accurate, and guess what it could do? Reduce your anxiety systems, right? These are the concepts that we're looking at. The last one, which is this awareness, is it's a mathematical, it's a metacognitive awareness of accuracy with a confidence accuracy correspondence. She's got her PhD, so she calculates it all and comes up with this number, okay? There's a great book out there called Interoception, and you could look at it, but it's pretty amazing. I love this picture. This is from the Fascia Research Society. I'm a founding member, and they made, like the bodies exhibit? Well, they went to the place in Germany where that was all really created, and they made one for fascia. But this is so cool because you can see the fascia of the heart, and then you can see how it's blended to your diaphragm. So again, it's not like you have a heart and you have a diaphragm, and the diaphragm's for breathing and the heart's for pumping blood. They're actually connected. And you need to get that breath in order to help the heart move, and the fascia's monitoring both of those systems, and then it's sending messages up to your vagus nerve and your basal ganglion and your cortex, and it's helping you to feel and understand what's actually happening in your body, and it's building your intuition, and it's improving your health, and then it's changing your hormonal activities and altering the hormone flow through your body. So this is a simplified picture, and if you look at the left, you'll see sensory processing. And so the sensory processing is coming in, and as it comes in, it relays and it goes up into higher areas of your brain and higher areas of your brain, and then it comes back down to do motor activities. So that's that which one is controlling what, and then it alters muscle, pain, proprioception, endocrine systems, body perceptions. If you look at the green one for body sensations, it actually goes and modifies your own interoception. So as this information's going in and out, it's changing itself. There's a book, The Brain That Changes Itself. You can actually change your own brain networks. You can actually take information and alter your own perceptions of your own experiences of life and change the activity of your own brain. Unfortunately, sometimes it's just you try these things, but it doesn't really work, and you need somebody else to help you with it. You need somebody to activate your frontal lobe so it controls your basal ganglion, or you need somebody to activate your basal ganglion, or if your cerebellum really is off, then you really are wobbling all over the place. You really are seeing your world do this. Well, you need to get your cerebellum recalibrated so that you can feel better. You can't just go, I'm happy, I enjoy my life, and as you're walking, you're doing this, and you're going, I really don't feel horrible, and I don't have vertigo. You do, and it doesn't feel good because you got to recalibrate your cerebellum, and then, you know, some of those positive affirmation things can feel better. So in here, this is looking at all these different parts of the brain, and you can see the body has these organs, and the organs are going up, and they're going where? Your hypothalamus, your brainstem, your spinal cord. These are all things like hypothalamus has this huge effect with hormones, all sorts of different activities like that. The brainstem's affecting digestion, breathing, all these things. Then it's going up into higher areas of your brain for different processing, and you can see there's this insular cortex and motor cortex. I'll show you a little bit in the next. But what does it affect? So what does that affect for you? What could it do? Well, it can give you psychiatric disorders. It can give you neurological disorders. It can give you addiction, chronic visceral pain, neurodegenerative problems, neurodevelopmental problems, pelvic floor, musculoskeletal, comorbid conditions. And guess what? Where you're looking at this and you're going, oh, what happens if my interoception's off, and what can it impact? All these things. But at the same time, remember, everything's two-way streets. So all those things can affect your organ system. So if you have those, it's a two-way street, and there's ways to improve them and get them better. That's the fun of neurology. Now, this is just one technique. So this was an article I wrote. I don't quite know how people knew to ask me, but somebody came and asked me and said, hey, could you write an article on some of your case results with NeuroEmotional Technique? And I didn't really want to do that. So instead, I wrote an article on their research. So it's just their research. It's not, oh, I worked on a patient and I helped them with their emotional perceptions and then that changed something. I didn't write anything like that. I just wrote, what does their research say? So when you look at the research, and in the article I wrote a couple things. So I just highlighted them here. It's like, who are we? Where's our mind located? What's the relationship between the mind and body? And these are the questions we've been discussing here for a little bit. And what the answers are a lot of them are still unknown. So even D.D. Palmer, so D.D. Palmer is the founder of chiropractic, these were the things that he was looking at. And interestingly, what they looked at is they said subluxations, these spinal misalignments, this translation and muscle tensions and movement of vertebrae are caused by thoughts, trauma, and toxins. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, this guy was like, if you eat something poisonous, it affects your motor system and subluxates you. If you think toxic thoughts, it affects your body and your motor system. Or if you fall and get hurt, it affects your motor system. So that was his idea, and he was right. He was right, and that was all still relatively unknown at the time. And so when he started to put that together, we didn't even know there were actually cells called neurons. That was all being argued and debated. It didn't get proved till the 1940s. So when he was looking at this idea, he was way ahead of his time in understanding that the motor system changes in response to thoughts, toxins, and trauma. And he understood that when you get subluxated, your level of health decreases. So that was the foundation of chiropractic, was this. And so we still, in neuroscience today, are working to understand this. So there's a technique called NeuroEmotional Technique. And what they did was they got 23 participants. And the really exciting thing was they funded the research through, I don't remember the university right now, it's in the article, through some really good universities with really top-notch neuroscientists. And they got 23 people, but the people that they got took psychological assessments. One of them was an impact of an event scale. Another one was state trait, anxiety scales, symptom inventories, post-traumatic inventory. So they gave these people these scales, and what they did was they went through and they picked a group who had really, really bad PTSD, who had not improved with other therapies. And then they went through and they talked to them about their life, and they made this script. And the script was a script that was reminding them of what happened and what they weren't dealing with. They put them inside of a functional MRI, and then they read the script to them. And while they read the script to them, they saw that brain states associated with anxiety became very active. So your parahippocampus is like memory centers and things like that. So the memory centers were affected. Your anterior cingulate is like all this suffering and emotional processing. The insular cortex is this, it's way old kind of part of your brain for memories and emotionalities. And then what they were really excited about was the cerebellum activated. So the midline cerebellum activated, and they were kind of like, wow, they were really surprised. But of course, because that's the old emotional brain. So these are some of the different areas that became activated, and they're associated what we call your limbic system. So limbic system's emotional, okay? And what they then did was they did NeuroEmotional Technique with them. So NeuroEmotional Technique is, not all the doctors here do it. It's really primarily, his name's Dr. Bauth. So he does that and a bunch of other techniques. And it's checking people's muscle responses in relationship to concepts and questions. So it's like, how does your muscle strength change in relationship to this concept? How does your muscle strength change in relationship to that concept? And they're looking at this sensory input through sound and hearing, and then a motor output. And they're saying, well, that means that you're not congruent with this idea. And then they do a little bit of like rubbing different spots or contacting different spots and then rechecking, and then the person's muscle strength improves. So they went through and they did the NET treatments, and the control group didn't have any changes in their findings. So the control group didn't actually get better on the situation, but the treatment group did get better compared to their initial findings. Their depression ratings improved, their anxiety ratings improved, their autonomic nervous system improved, their heart rate went down so we can monitor, so their heart rate decreased when they read it, and then they reran the MRI. So the MRI on the left, you can see that this part of their brain became active in the amygdala, and then afterward it wasn't active. In their article you can see the activity of the other parts of the brain. So what's really exciting is that this guy, Dr. Newberg, he said he's been published over 200 times in relationship to neurocognitive aspects, and he's actually never seen results like this with a lot of the things that he did. So this NeuroEmotional technique created a pre and post change in people's emotional brains, and he was just astonished. And it did it not just on a functional MRI, but it did it on all of these accepted anxiety questionnaires. And interestingly enough, they used someone, they said that the person wasn't like a highly advanced neuroemotional technique practitioner, they just had taught them. So they have this one foundation. You can look at some more stuff. I didn't think to ask you this, Frank, I'm sorry, but are you able to click that onefoundation.org so we can watch the video? Let's see how this goes. It might mess up our thing, but this is mostly the end slide, so see if you can watch this video. They did other studies on back pain patients. So this one's on PTSD. This is on people with PTSD that didn't get better with other treatments. They did other ones on people who had back pain that hadn't got better with treatments, and so they control click thing. So they looked at those. Let's see. A commercial. Oh, yeah. That's okay. Are you going to play it? How are we doing? I'm not even talking.
I want to make sure that people at home can see it.
Yeah, I'm waiting on the delay.
Oh, really? So the people with the back pain got better too, which is wild, right? Because they didn't like really work on them or anything. They just, well, they worked on them with the neuroemotional technique. Sorry, we're just trying to get this queued up. We always enjoy technology. Fortunately, Dr. Patterson is really good at this stuff. If you go to like onefoundation.org, just go to onefoundation.org.
We have the video pulled up, we just need to be able to see it in the stream.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the challenges that we have in healthcare is finances. You know, there's nobody with $1 trillion funding everything. So this is called the One Foundation, and this is, if you go to it, you could look it up, but it's the onefoundation.org, and they're working to do research to show these different health benefits for people.
Own commercial real estate. Yes, you. Why don't you own commercial property? After all, just one commercial deal.
All right, here we go. Can you hear that, Doc?
If people can get the vision of a planet where people know how to de-stress, only then can we have a world that's actually safe and peaceful to live in.
If you can address a person's stress in their life, I feel like that should
That's
be
good.
number one.
When somebody's under a lot of stress, at least emotional stress, a whole
cascade of things can be going on, from neck problems to low back problems to stomach problems to anxiety.
But if we can get to what is the underlying cause that keeps getting re-triggered, lives can change.
You can have all the positive affirmations you want and intend for different things to happen.
Huh?
And that's all cognitive, that's all your brain thinking. But this was distinctly different.
I just turned off the power on my thing, which I don't need.
I'm not a psychiatrist, and so seeing the changes to me were among the more dramatic that I've ever seen with regard to any kind of intervention, any kind of medical or psychological type of therapy for people.
It just wasn't there anymore for most of those patients. In fact, everybody had some response where there was far less to no activation.
I think the consciousness of people in general is real open that maybe I have something to do with my health condition.
Stress is a fact of life, and healing can be a fact of life.
So those last two people were Dr. Deb and Scott Walker, who really developed that technique, and they really spent their lives working to help people overcome stress responses and to be healthy. So, but what happens is all of these things are integrated. So it's good to have a approach that understands them all, takes them all into account. Get your balance better. Get your interoceptive systems working better. Get your fascial network working better. Improve your breathing rates. Improve your posture. Saccades are these different eye movements that are very fast, and they're associated with higher order brain centers. So we can look at different motor activities, and we can interpolate what's happening with different regions of the brain. Then we can do treatments, improve those regions of the brain, and then see that people's stress responses are getting better, decision making is getting better, their pain is getting less, the pain's not interfering with their life, their vertigo improves. And the idea is that, you know, that you're just stressed out is not enough. It's not enough for the person. Of course you're stressed out. You have vertigo. You had a concussion. Your cognitive processing, you can't read. I mean, you're going to be stressed. That's not the answer. And you don't just have to live with it. There are solutions. It's just that the scientific community and the doctors were just doing their best to find them still. But there are people out there that have solutions for thousands and thousands of people that suffer those types of things. So that is pretty much the share. If you click the next button, it'll go to the thing. That's okay. And we do have some time for questions, if there are any. Pretty good online there, Dr. Hose?
Yep.
Really?
We have questions. We have two if you don't have any.
Oh yeah, let's do it. Oh, okay. Oh, wow. Does multisensory integration account for tasting a smell? Yeah, so there's a thing called synesthesia. And some people will taste numbers, or some people will hear smells, or some people will feel, you know, they'll feel emotions, you know, which probably is a little not totally synesthesia. And one of the guys who talks a lot about this, his name's Ramachandran. He's got some really great information out there. But I was watching him one day, and he was proposing that we're supposed to have synesthesia. That way you can feel your body move, or you can, you know, maybe hearing past somebody's voice is a form of synesthesia. Maybe hearing the pain in their voice is a form of synesthesia. So tasting a smell can be multisensory integration. Now, some are more connected. So the reality is that taste is primarily considered off of smell. So we think we're tasting, but the reality is a major part of that is coming from smell. And unfortunately, people can get different smell problems. That was a big thing with COVID, is people were having smell, they were losing their smell. And we were working on a lot of people here for that and getting really, really great results. And then when they felt like they're emotionally labile and just flat affect, that also came back. You also see that in Parkinson's and things, where people's smells go down and their gait gets stiff and they emotionally change. So, but taste and smell definitely go together. Some people argue there's a cranial nerve called cranial nerve 0, which isn't really for smell, but it's for pheromones. And the pheromones kind of impact how you feel about people. Can you recalibrate the cerebellum to avoid the bobblehead effect? Yes. We love doing that. So, can you recalibrate the cerebellum to avoid the bobblehead effect? Absolutely. What happens, there's a lot to it, but there's a lot of effects in it. But particularly, like if you're walking, one of the fastest reflexes is when your foot hits the ground, your head bobbles. And when your head bobbles, your eye should move opposite. But it happens so quick that your head doesn't really bobble. But some people, it gets too slow and their head bobbles. You can recalibrate it by doing different head and neck exercises. But if the brain can't integrate that like the way it really should, you might have to only do the eyes because your eyes and your neck are connected. Or you might have to do it by recalibrating something with their feet or their knees. So it's not simple enough to say, this is how it works and go do this. Now the big thing with that is that your inner ear activates an area called your vestibular nuclei, and right next to your vestibular nuclei are nausea centers. So what happens is if you spin around and you're bobbling, it affects your nausea centers. Well, what does nausea do? Nausea affects your digestive system, because the nerves that go to your digestive system are also right there, and they're related to the vestibular nuclei, so it's balance. So what ends up happening is people get, say, a bobblehead, they get dizzy, they get nauseous, it changes their digestive mechanisms, but we also know that if it's not from your head and neck and you just maybe eat something that doesn't feel good, you get nauseous, but you might also get anxious. Or when people get anxious, they get nauseous. You know, the classic is watching weddings on YouTube, right? And you just see them. They start swaying around and then they're going to pass out because the emotional response of that moment in their life, they were just so excited and happy that they stopped breathing, and then boom. So the emotional response affected their posture and their movement. And unfortunately, some people can lose bowel and bladder function when that happens, because the vestibular system, the nausea center, and anxiety centers are all there, and they're all interrelated. So which one caused what, you have to tweeze out, and then you have to find that right answer and help the person integrate it so that they don't have it anymore. But if the head's bobbling, that is definitely one of the things, and it can get better. Yes, doctor?
As a massage therapist, is NET effective when doing body work on someone in grief? And could you
Yeah. So the question was, as a massage therapist, is NET effective for somebody who has grief? Yes, they did the research on it. It is huge. And in NeuroEmotional Technique, they have a lot of people. So some people that do it are doctors, some people are acupuncturists, some people are psychologists. So they talk about more body entry versus emotional entry. So when they do the technique for body entry, they have people touch different parts of their body and they see how they respond. When they do it for emotional responses, they have people say or think things, and then they watch how the body responds. And people get better. People get way better. And then their pain also can go away.
That's it, no more questions.
Cool. Are we pretty good? You didn't have an emotional question.
I do, but I don't know if it's...
Oh, come on.
Okay, well, I was going to say, I think a helpful question is like, when you're doing, as a practitioner, when you don't have the patient in front of you that's like, oh, like doing body mapping, for example, or a neuro exercise, and they're hitting it. They're doing great. They're hitting all the points. But they start feeling strange. So as a practitioner, like, you can obviously, if they start crying or something, that's a giveaway that it's emotional. But what are some other things that you can, like, pick out that would lead you to go there next on that chart? Do you get what I'm saying? Versus going to, like, their pursuits are not getting better, let's go to sound mapping. It's like versus having them do NET for that thing.
So they're having a hard time with the map and they're getting anxious?
They're doing good on the map, but
Yeah.
it's making them anxious. But when you work on other students or other practitioners, they have the capability of telling you that.
Yeah.
So in a patient setting, how can you identify that?
But you saw them get anxious.
Maybe, but sometimes.
Okay, so let me try to answer it.
Yeah.
So the question is from one of our future amazing emotional healer people, is from a practitioner's perspective, because she's almost a doctor, is if you're doing a technique, like I like to do what I call body mapping. So I'll touch a person on a certain part of their body and then they touch where I'm touching. It's in medicine, it's called single point localization. Okay, or we have sound maps, like can you hear where your world is? Because if you're not hearing where your world is accurately, but you see, like if you see somebody here, but you hear them over there, it gives you anxiety. It's a form of a sensory mismatch. If you feel like your arm, if you don't feel where your arm is, it gives you these sensory mismatches. So one of the things she's been doing are these body map testing, single point localization. And then the question is, if the person starts to get anxiety, maybe, I'm going to reframe her question a little bit, what are ways you could see it? Well, you watch autonomics. So the autonomic nervous system is a huge window into people's emotions. So people can alter easier, they can alter their physical action of what they do in response to an emotion. If they get angry, they might not move their arm. They can hold it. But other things, like if you watch movies with the CIA and they ask you questions and they look at your pupil reactions, so you start to look at, that's an autonomic. You can actually put monitors on people's bodies and you can monitor galvanic skin responses and you can see how the electricity is moving through their body. You could monitor it. You could put a heart rate monitor on, an oxygen monitor on, a skin temperature monitor, or you could just feel their skin temperature. Watch if their face changes colors, or their hands change color, or their feet change color. If you have a stethoscope, you listen for bowel sounds and you see if their bowel sounds go up or go down. Some people, in response to stress, the sympathetics should really make your bowel sounds decrease, but sometimes it makes them increase. So you're watching the autonomics, and then which ones do you watch? It's individual to the person. So you can't say, this is the thing I watch and this is it. I just watch their heart rate. Because the reality is their bowel sounds might change. So you got to learn to watch that. Some people will literally bloat right there. They know it too. People who have that, you might think, oh, what happened to me? You literally start to bloat in response to stress responses, and then you start to feel tight in your abdomen, but it actually happened. So that might be what happens for someone, or their skin color might change, or temperature, but autonomics is the way to go. And then when you see it, you might say, hey, you're having an emotional, I think you would have to decide, like, did they have something in the brain that stopped controlling the autonomics? Or did they have an emotional response that activated their autonomics? So sometimes when you're doing things and you're doing physical activities and you're moving around, you might think that your autonomics might fire higher, but they're firing higher because you're doing something. But sometimes it's just the emotion. So it's not that the brain quit working well, it's just they were just having an emotional response. And then you just go check it. You just go check off the NET and you check a body entry or a cognitive entry, and then you look and see if it indicates. If it doesn't indicate, they might need a different technique, you know, or NET has like hundreds of different approaches to it. So have you taken many of their classes? Okay, you'll love it. Yeah, so are you going to be here tomorrow? There's going to be people teaching cool things here tomorrow. Yeah, yeah, I'll make sure you know about it. I don't exactly know what they're teaching, but I know I'm teaching somewhere else and someone's going to be here. So, but okay then. Well,
we have one more question.
Oh, do you? Oh, well, great. Let's do it. We have one more.
What could be a cause for someone not really knowing what emotional state they're in?
Yeah, that is a great question. So the question is, what could be a cause for a person not really knowing the emotional state they're in? And that's a big deal. Your frontal lobe is really important in helping you to understand how your body feels and what it's doing. And a lot of times when people get concussions or head injuries, their frontal lobes go down, and that's actually one of the ways to test is how do you feel, and how many different types of emotions can you describe? So one of the things that we look at in relationship to language centers. So language centers and your temporal lobe is also associated with gradations of emotions. And what some people think is that maybe your emotions are based on your language. So they'll look at a thing and they'll say, well, there's just a few basic emotions like happy, sad, angry, sorrow. Like there's these few basic emotions that every culture really has, and they have them all. And some people say, well, that's really the only emotions we have. And the rest of them are just sort of like it. But other people say, no, we really have this huge spectrum of emotions. Elation, excitation. You know, you can't just say, oh, those are the same. That's happy. That's kind of a flat way to view the world. And they say our language drives our emotional concepts. So different languages will have different little subtle, like one that my friend told me in Germany is, I won't get it quite right, but it's like a shadow happiness. And it's like you kind of are feeling good that something went a little wrong for someone, you know? I don't know if you know what that's like, but somebody was really, really mean to you, and then they turn around and hit the wall, and you kind of like, you feel a little bad about feeling a little good, you know? They have a word for it, whereas I think in English we don't particularly have it. So your language systems dictate your emotional system. And if you don't have a good language skill, you might not have good emotional skills. If your frontal lobe's not working well, you can lose gradation of emotionality. And when your memory system goes off, you might not remember all the different things in your life and how they really felt. I had a patient, he had full amnesia. He didn't really remember anything. And I got him to remember his whole life again. But unfortunately, he had been in the military, or fortunately, and then he had to deal with that memory. So his brain had quit working, and he had lost his memory, but he also kind of had lost all the different forms of emotion because he didn't have any memory. But then when the memory came back, the emotions came back, and they regained their gradation. So it's looking at all those different aspects of the brain, and if you lose them, you can just sort of become flat. Good? Okay. All right, well, again, thank you all so much. Appreciate you being here. Hope that was helpful. And next month, Dr. Bauth will be talking about emotions, and then hopefully we'll be able to put this up online as well, and you could rewatch them. Are we okay, Doc? Are we done? All right, and with Dr. Hose says we're good, so we're good. Thank you.